So this is about a new technology that's being adopted very enthusiastically by some groups in a complex housing ecosystem, for lack of a better word. And I used to teach the history of journalism. I am going to get to the point, don't worry. It also is the history of new technologies. The printing press, the telegraph, the telephone, radio, TV, the internet, all the rest of it. And when I used to teach this, it became clear to me, the more that I read, that each new technology was always accompanied by two reactions. One was the utopian view. This new technology will open up knowledge to more people and the world will get better. And there was this dystopian view. This new technology will be used to manipulate the information that people get and produce a host of negative consequences. And you might think this is new. It's so far from being new that you saw exactly that with the printing press and the book in 1500 and whatever it was. So one group was very enthusiastic about the development of the printing press. It could be used to print Bibles and give the people direct access to the messages of God. Another group pointed out that it was actually primarily being used to produce pornography and wild misinformation about news and politics. You think that some of the disinformation sites are bad now? You should have seen the pamphlets in the British Civil War, or the English Civil War. They were terrible. And also, people complained that healthy social interaction had been destroyed because people were isolating themselves, not speaking to each other because they had their heads in books and they weren't talking. Radio. The masses would be able to listen to educational programs and great music, or the masses would be led into supporting the Nazis who propagated their messages through this new medium of the radio. The internet. I don't think I even have to tell you what the reactions have been. So it's the same in other sectors and construction among them. There's with mass media. Every time something new comes along, there's generally a group that is enthusiastic and a group of doubters. And sometimes the doubters are right. Think about asbestos, or freeways, or the concept of building mass social housing projects with towers set in big open spaces where all the poor could live together with no security and a design that really didn't work for them. And sometimes the enthusiasts are right. The elevator, which has given millions of people access to housing in central cities. Congestion pricing, which as we just saw in New York, has been a wild success, just as it was in London and Stockholm. It's never 100% one way or the other, though. The car changed cities for the better in one way. It removed tons of horse manure and some serious health problems that went along with that. And it changed cities for the worse in other ways that we all know about. Just in the 30 years that I've been writing about development, construction, and housing, a constant I've seen is the search for new models and new techniques and new materials for building. And I've seen a lot of experiments, not just with materials. When I went to San Diego in 1999, they were looking at how to reinvent the single-room residential hotel. When the Olympic Village was being designed and constructed in the years leading up to 2010, I heard a lot about this thing of in-floor heating with rubber tubes that nobody thought was going to work. I'm sure they're not rubber. Someone will correct me on that. And also the new concept of providing heat for the units there by extracting heat from sewers, which I have to say I still don't understand, but apparently it works. And I've written a lot about the many efforts to come with new techniques for modular housing, including Oliver Lang out in Delta and his efforts at robotic assembly. And then there's the current tug of war going on over whether to allow single stair design for buildings up to 6 stories. I'm assuming this crowd, I don't have to explain what single stair is. When the condo boom exploded in the late 1970s and the 1980s, there was a lot of enthusiasm for this new form of tenure and the kinds of buildings going up around Vancouver. And then, when it turned out that there was a system-wide problem with leaks, a problem that was so serious that an entire branch of government had to be created to deal with it, the Homeowner Protection Office. Obviously, the doubters had their day. And that same office also temporarily prohibited green roofs because they felt that there were too many unknowns about whether this new idea might lead to even more problems with water getting into buildings. So in the end, those two problems, the leaky condos and the green roofs, were solved, and we still have condos and we have a lot of green roofs in the city, but not without some examination of what had gone wrong or could go wrong. So now we're in the era of mass timber, a construction material that has a lot of promise. The BC government and many others is unmistakably in the camp of the enthusiasts. And a 2024 report from the German financial services company Alliance has estimated that the global mass timber market is projected to reach 1.5 billion, almost the cost of a West Side house, by 2031. So BC has its mass timber action plan, all caps, in place since April 2022 with the aim of building more mass timber buildings, expanding mass timber manufacturing, increasing the mass timber workforce, developing the mass timber ecosystem, and advancing low carbon construction. And it has allowed what's called encapsulated mass timber construction, EMTC, in case anyone refers to that later in the evening, up to 12 stories for several years, and then that was increased to 18 stories last April. So you'll hear from people way more expert than me tonight that this new building material has many advantages, especially in a province that has a lot of trees and is potentially these days looking for new markets for them. Mass timber, which is this new kind of manufactured wood that provides the strength and stability of giant planks of old-growth forest, but essentially created by gluing or doweling or various other techniques to keep the bits of wood together, is lighter and cheaper than steel or concrete. It's more sustainable than steel or concrete. It's easier, can be easier to ship around than steel or concrete, but it has its risks. And we're going to hear a lot about them, but just to quickly summarize: fire during both during construction and after, water, which is, we all know the damage that can cause in many ways, wood-loving bugs, a shortage of knowledgeable builders to work with it, and just getting enough of it. I think at least one panelist will mention tonight, even in BC, mass timber can be hard to come by because so little is produced here, and that's just one of the supply chain issues. So as I said, I'm not going to get into the details because there's some very knowledgeable people here who are going to speak about that, and I'm sure we're all going to learn something about this tonight, although I think there's a lot of experts out in the audience as well. So it'll be interesting to hear all about this new, potentially city-changing technology. So in a minute, you're going to vote pro or con. And there's two votes, one now and one at the end. And the team that wins is the one that moves people the most. And sometimes it's actually not good to get a strong vote for your side at the beginning, because then there's more possibility that people will move over, that you're not going to win people from 80 to 85%. So you're going to vote now. Then each member of our two-person debate team will give their opening statements of 7 minutes. I will moderate then an exchange period in which the debaters get to pose questions and arguments to each other directly, and we'll give the audience a chance to ask a couple of questions, so get those ready. And again, this is an audience where you can probably go into some detail. Then each debater will give a closing statement of 2 minutes, and then you get asked to vote again. It's really nice if you don't leave in the middle. And the team that wins is the one that changed the most minds. So even if they still lose at the end, but if they converted some of you over, they win. That's the way it works. If only it were like that in the real world. So go ahead and vote while the music is playing. Dun, ta-da! Okay, here we are, first vote. And, okay, so the pro, which is it's not worth the risk, right? I have that right? Is 19%, and con is 81. So that means those of you arguing for it are going to have to do quite a job to hang on to your 81. So on the pro side, that it's not worth the risk, we have Dr. Adam Rysanek, Associate Professor of Environmental Systems at the UBC School of Architecture and Landscape Architecture, and someone who co-directs the UBC Masters of Engineering Leadership in High Performance Buildings. Dr. Rysanek's research centers on strategies for climate mitigation and adaptation. He has guided low-carbon demonstration projects in the UK, Singapore, and Canada, and most recently, the Third Space at UBC. And also on his team is Brewster, who is the Senior Director, Development at West Group Properties, one of the city's biggest condo and rental apartment builders. He leads West Group's mass timber exploration and execution with an eye to building better buildings faster, while also understanding and sharing the complexities of innovation in development. This has led to the founding of the Western Mass Timber Alliance, which is a group of industry people sharing the challenges of mass timber with a tree-to-key understanding. I have no idea what that means. Okay, so welcome up our pro team, and I'm asking you to give them a little drum roll as they come up. And now, on the con team, Shawn is Executive Director of Woodworks BC and a structural engineer with deep expertise in mass timber. Before joining Woodworks, he spent nearly a decade in consulting at a leading design firm. He holds master's degrees in both engineering and business and serves on several mass timber advisory committees. And his teammate is Jana Foit, a principal and higher education practice lead for the Vancouver studio of Perkins & Will, an architecture firm very famous for its sustainability work, for the one person in here who doesn't know that already. She has over 2 decades of experience and has led several mass timber projects that include the Earth Science Building and Gateway Building at UBC, as well as the under construction BCIT Tall Timber Student Housing Project, which I just passed the other day on the road. So again, a drum roll, please welcome them to the stage. Come on, Jana. Okay, so we start with Adam, arguing for the motion, mass timber is not worth the risks. 7 minutes.
Thank you, Francis. Hi, everybody. My name's Adam, and I'm going to try to keep to 7 minutes, so I'm going to skip over who I am. The question about mass timber is not the risk is tricky for me. I am a low carbon specialist and academic, and in fact, buildings like this, Herman Kaufman, who's inspired even some work here, of course, falls into teaching. I happen to inhabit the Center for Interactive Research on Sustainability, which was a sort of hallmark mass timber building. It's a beautiful building. The use of the technology is fantastic. There is an association of sustainability, and yet I'm pro this motion. And I have to say, the starting point, and I heard in Francis' opening, this idea that it's a more sustainable technology, it's more sustainable than steel and concrete, but there are some risks. Even this sort of advertisement for this debate had this sort of, it is low carbon, but aren't there risks? And I just want to start off there by saying we, of course, wouldn't be having this debate if we didn't already presume this to be the case. If this wasn't from the very beginning a low-carbon technology, a sustainable technology, we never would have seen the adoption early on the way we did, and we wouldn't have gotten the industry to where we are today, now having a debate about it. And I feel we're going to talk about this carbon thing because depending on which way we want to go, we might want to belittle now and say, well, maybe it isn't about carbon, it's about affordability and rapid manufacturing. There's a lot of other stuff going on. But if you look at our BC housing plan, you look at the City of Vancouver's statement on mass timber construction, climate action are the #1 benefits cited for the use of and adoption of mass timber. We take it for granted that it is a low carbon technology, and why not? Studies are abound in the last 10 to 15 years as mass timber was early adopted that we do the LCAs, we plug it into our LCA tools, and we find that mass timber can save anywhere between 20 and 40% carbon. We account for all of our materials. And there's some assumptions, of course, this biogenic thing. I mean, do we take credit for the tree? There's carbon in the building, but that carbon will get released back to the atmosphere when the building dies. It's a 1-to-1. Or do we not even talk about that at all? We just say there's no sequestered carbon. There's a lot of research involved there. And at the end of the day, these review studies have come up. They plug in the numbers, and we see these savings that we've all become accustomed to. Now, my training as a researcher has come from the energy efficiency domain, energy simulation domain. And I'm going to bring up some lessons learned from that domain. And for those of you who might be used to energy simulation tools and a word that we are more increasingly using, uncertainty, with these estimates, that will come to play. And that plays in LCAs, especially for those of you, and I'm sure there are in the audience, who've undertaken LCAs. Estimates of the life cycle of existing known buildings. So we're talking about 20-40% savings compared to reinforced concrete. Well, when we do an LCA on an existing building, a life cycle assessment that accounts for all the carbon ins and outs of one to it. This was a pilot study done at UBC. 20 hours spent using individual software tools and different stages of construction documents to calculate the embodied carbon. Alone, just by nature of the simulation tool used, the estimation tool used, nothing about the actual design changing the building, you get a variation in the embodied carbon of the building by 10%. We're now dealing with 20 to 40% savings, and you have an embedded uncertainty in the models of 10% from the very beginning. Part of that uncertainty, and one of the examples are showing that pre and post, so there was an even greater divide. And the greater divide in estimates is that when you're at pre-concept of estimating the embodied carbon of the building to post, there's some assumptions have to be made. You don't know exactly how many fasteners and of what type you may have in pre-concept. And in your as-built, you may find that actually 26% of the embodied carbon of the structure in a mass timber building is from the fasteners that have nothing to do with mass timber, but need to be there. Even more so, more importantly, is stuff that doesn't even happen at the building site, but in the forest. And I can just go ahead, there's kind of little in those studies, maybe to this example, this is a kind of Sierra Club study, the synthesizing report. All these saplings that are growing in clear-cut forests, they have to compete with the carbon emissions of all the stuff that's been left after clear-cut. You have forest management practices that are working in tandem with this, trying to do a good job of making sure those saplings grow. But research in the last few years, doing dynamic, time-varying LCAs, where year in and year out we account what's happening in the forest, are showing that, in fact, there's a much greater uncertainty, and if anything, there's in fact a net carbon emissions from clear cutting to mass timber production, especially if a building doesn't last over a century long, which we still today have no evidence of happening. The resounding conclusion, this was a very recent study of a mass timber LCA in Australia that tried to encapsulate explicitly all the uncertainties in the process. You see these bands, which you can't really see in the color bars, but if you see these dotted lines hashing above, on my side, it's a little bit more clear. The net savings, mass timber is the lower line and reinforced concrete the target. The uncertainty of the two overlaps so much, you cannot say definitively, without ambiguity, that a mass timber building is lower carbon than a reinforced concrete building. It might be, and we might be moving in that direction, but there are a lot of uncertainties embedded in this process. Where have we seen this before? And why maybe 20 to 40% savings is not enough? In the energy environment domain, energy efficiency domain, we now know, this is a study from the UK that looks at simulation tools used to score a building, which is the first column, and then what the energy consumption is of those buildings at the end when they actually get built. We know of a term called the performance gap in energy simulation. Typically, when you do an energy simulation of building to estimate how much energy will be used when it gets built, it's plus or minus 25, if not 40 to 50%. The policies required to get even decent energy efficiency buildings need to today target 80% savings, which is where Passive House and all of these high ambitious energy performance standards like the Energy Step Code have come about. You can't do it with a targeted 20-40% savings and then call yourself low carbon or energy efficient. You need to go to way more advancement if you haven't taken into account your uncertainties in your estimates. So in short, typically estimated carbon savings of mass timber may not be significant enough to overcome uncertainties. It is not worth the risk, and this is where we're going to get into the question of what are we actually debating here. It's not worth the risk of diluting ourselves from the very beginning of our debate that mass timber is a low carbon solution. The verdict is out. It's far more uncertain. More data is required, and what governments need to do is, in fact, do what we do in healthcare and other services, incorporate statistical uncertainty, our uncertainties in our model, so we have much more informed decisions. But heading into it now with these simplified estimates is exactly what we did 30 years ago with the energy domain, and we have lots of lessons learned of showing just how ill-willed and ill-performing that assumption was. I have more to show, but we'll talk about it later. Thank you.
Well, that was a very spirited and robust rebuttal, I would say. Okay, Shawn, keep your 81% with you. Just try.
I might be out of a job tomorrow if I don't, so we'll see what we can do. Good evening, everyone. My name is Shawn Keys, the Executive Director of Woodworks BC. Myself and my teammate Jana tonight are here to argue on the con side of the motion, specifically that mass timber is worth the risk. Yes, mass timber is a game changer when it comes to sustainability and reducing the embodied carbon footprint of our buildings, as Jana will discuss in a lot more detail and like to exchange a little bit later on. However, we're not arguing that it's without risk. Every new construction project carries risk. Every new innovation comes with innovation costs. However, these risks are manageable and the cost of innovation decreases over time. The construction industry as we know it is broken. It's been stagnant for the past 50 years and it continues to use labor-intensive methods and failing to innovate. According to a global study by McKinsey, construction has seen nearly zero productivity gain in the last 25 years since the year 2000, while other sectors like manufacturing have nearly doubled their output per hour of labor, creating a 77% productivity gap between manufacturing and construction in just the last 25 years. And what's even more disturbing is that when you look at North America, we've actually decreased productivity by 2% since 2000. And for those of you who are too young to remember the year 2000, any students in the crowd, this is when flat screen TVs first started becoming popular. A 42-inch plasma would cost a staggering $13,000 in today's budget. You can buy a bigger, better TV now today for under $500. And yet, in construction, we've made no significant improvements. In BC, we're facing a massive housing shortage. Everybody knows that. According to CMHC, we need to build over 600,000 new homes by 2030, which would be almost double the pace of current construction. At the same time, 72% of BC construction companies are reporting severe labor shortages. And if that isn't enough, the existential threat of a trade war means rising material costs and economic instability. And as a result, construction, real estate prices continue to increase, creating a devastating housing affordability crisis. As we know all too well, Vancouver is the least affordable city in North America. So the question isn't, is change necessary? It's how quickly can we change and what solutions can we adopt? Mass timber is not a silver bullet, but it's a part of that solution. By combining low carbon materials, prefabrication, and fire performance, it's an excellent option to replace concrete and more carbon intensive materials in taller and larger buildings. Mass timber is prefabricated off-site in a controlled environment. That means higher quality, greater manufacturing efficiency, and most importantly, faster construction timelines. Mass timber can reduce construction by up to 25% schedule savings. While the other side may argue that these time savings are just theoretical, they have been proven on several real-world projects. The Ascent project in Milwaukee is a 25-story mass timber tower, which is built at a rate of 1 floor per week with just 12 people. It saved approximately 4 months in construction timeline and 66% in structural labor costs. In Oakland, the 1510 Webster project was 25% faster than a concrete alternate and resulted in a net savings to the owner of $30 million. Here in Vancouver, UBC Brock Commons was an 18-story mass timber building and saved an estimated 2 months compared to concrete. While nothing in construction is free and these time savings are not guaranteed, they are possible with effective planning and execution. strategy is not very common in our construction sector. And as the highest earthquake risk zone in Canada, seismic forces in the Lower Mainland continue to increase with every building code cycle. The good news is that a mass timber building is roughly 50% the weight of a concrete alternate, making the forces that we're designing for as structural engineers roughly half. Mass timber also represents a made-in-Canada solution. BC's forestry sector is a cornerstone of our economy, contributing $17.4 billion to our GDP and providing 1 of 28 jobs in the province. Wood products are also our second largest export as a province, making domestic use and expanding wood use here at home even more critical. Mass timber alone is projected to add 4,000 jobs by 2035 in the province and strengthen a critical domestic industry while providing opportunities to support rural and Indigenous communities in expanding a supply chain. Mass timber actually isn't a new idea. It has been around for more than 100 years. A tested solution that's been used in the form of nail laminated timber, a popular form of construction in Vancouver and Toronto in the early 1900s. This building that you're seeing on the screen is the Landing Building in downtown Vancouver, built in 1905 and still standing strong today. The Steamworks Brewery, you might recognize it. When it comes to fire safety, mass timber has been extensively tested. Predictable fire performance and char rates are recognized by the BC Building Code. And yes, there are innovation costs, but BC has the tools to mitigate these short-term risks and lead widespread adoption as a province. We have the natural resources with more third-party certified forested area than any other country in the world, not province, any country. We have the supply chain with more than 7 suppliers active in Western Canada. And we have the local expertise. North America's leader in mass timber is the province of BC with over 360 completed projects, more than 20 times more per capita than the rest of the continent. And we have the government's support and political will. BC is the only place in the world with a dedicated office of mass timber implementation. In addition, tens of millions of dollars are invested by the provincial and federal government to support education, innovation, and capacity building, including programs like my own. So to those who argue that the risks are too high, I ask you, why keep doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results? In the face of an urgent climate and housing challenges, we need solutions that move us forward. Some may propose more exotic solutions like bamboo or low-carbon concrete alternates, but these are still years away from having meaningful impact and are less market-ready than mass timber. Low-carbon concrete also takes 20 to 40% longer to cure, further slowing down construction. And while mass timber is already market-ready, proven, and scalable, mass timber is worth the risk because there is no better alternative, and the risk of doing nothing is far greater. Thank you.
Okay, no gray middle ground here. So many different issues coming up than I had expected, so this is really fascinating. Graham, you're now going to argue for the pro side.
Einstein may have figured out that relativity stuff, but I don't think he's ever got a project approved in Vancouver.
How many projects have you done?
My name's Graham Brewster, Senior Director on the development team at West Group here in Vancouver. For the past 5 years, I've been leading, amongst other things, our intensive study of mass timber's role in development. Who is West Group? We're a local family-owned developer, builder, owner-operator, active for more than 60 years. We're of significant scale of breadth and experience with, at any given time, around 50 active development projects, thousands of units in condo, rental, and mixed use under construction across multiple sites and cities, and millions of square feet in our development pipeline. We take an extremely long-term and comprehensive view, executing long-term goals through practical and pragmatic day-by-day execution. All this to say, we understand this business intensively. It was through this lens that we started our adventure into this new and seemingly exciting world of mass timber. Knowing what we know, could we utilize mass timber to build better buildings faster? So off we went to test this thesis in a non-dogmatic fashion. So what is better? Sure, it may be lower carbon, although I may question that, but we developers care about the hard numbers, not soft ideals. How does it stack up in comparison to equivalent projects? Where is the additional value? Where are the demonstrable cost and schedule savings, and what does it amount to? We have so many active projects that making these comparisons with real-world data, sure enough, is possible. So we did, and we comparatively studied it on 6 projects totaling more than 600,000 square feet of varying types, just to understand it. Everything from tall timber towers, the 18-story towers, to tilt-up industrial and everything in between. Not only that, but we explored purchasing a mass timber production facility and business, giving us a whole insight right across the mass timber continuum, and spinning out of that the Western Mass Timber Alliance, a tight group of industry leaders that understand the complicated, interrelated components of the tree-to-key continuum. So that's what that is. And with all that, what have we learned? To understand the weight of the relevant risks of mass timber, specifically in the development and construction space, you need to understand the development business. Why this matters for relevant mass timber uptake is that, like it or not, 95% of the housing stock in this country is produced by private developers, and that's not going to change anytime soon. So here's a 3-minute crash course on how the development business works. The most important equation in real estate development is ensuring that the total project value, all the dollars brought in, exceed the total costs, all the dollars out, with a healthy profit or margin as a return for the work and risk taken on. How that's done is through a relatively simple process. As a developer, we create a product, quote unquote, through the development process while continually analyzing the overall project viability to ensure that at the end of the project, it's worth more than the collection of costs to produce it. To get into a little bit more detail, that product is an evolution of a concept. An initial idea becomes a simple set of drawings, which becomes an application, an increasingly complicated set of drawings, permits, floor plans, that eventually serve as a set of instructions to create the physical building to be handed over at closing. The process is the development life cycle. It's the initial acquisition, the evolution of an application to the point of a viability test, where the market, and most importantly a bank, will be comfortable enough with our viability assumptions to loan us enough money to actually construct the project to eventually hand over. And all the while, ensuring viability through the pro forma, the absolute backbone of our business. Understanding our basic value versus the cost equation in a little more detail, there are a few key cost buckets that need to be understood, and how these costs get incurred over time. Costs are bucketed into land, hard costs, what's actually constructed, soft costs, what's paid to the city, consultants, etc., financing, and importantly, they're spent at different times within the process. And time is important. Real estate development is all about managing risk over time. In development, we necessarily have to spend an immense amount of money throughout the entire development process in order to get to the end of the project. And only then can we and do we realize that value to get our money out of a project. These projects take longer and longer and are more and more costly and complicated, increasing the risk profile significantly. Furthermore, if your viability is jammed along the process, you get stuck. And you're in a world of hurt. You can't realize the value, get your dollars out, while you continue to incur costs, potentially leading to a vicious cycle and ultimately bankruptcy. As we've seen over the last little while, we've got to spend all that money throughout all the years of development to get to that little triangle in the top right corner. But hey, can't mass timber actually reduce my risk? Is it worth more? Is it faster? Where do I see those wins? Well, that's a good question, Mr. Brewster. When we talk about mass timber and development, it's important to separate the conversation into 2 often conflated elements. There's the material and the methodology. The material is the mass timber itself. It's the wood in glulam, CLT, or another that serves within a structural system as an alternative to concrete and steel. The methodology is the construction approach that is assumed, but not necessarily required, to most successfully deliver a project using mass timber. It's this methodology that brings the oft-touted benefits of schedule savings and quality increases through design for manufacturing, prefabrication, and off-site construction. Both have their theoretical rewards. The wood may be greener, and the methodology may be faster, but both also have distinct risks. Mass timber is clearly a poorly understood product and seen as a newer and definitely higher risk material, as evidenced by us debating it here tonight, plus the ongoing testing of the product itself, the hesitancy within building code, and the significant premiums levied by the insurance companies. That alone Betting against short-term construction and long-term performance by the insurance companies demonstrates the significant risk of the material. And the methodology. I've been hearing about the potential of prefab taking over the industry for as long as I've been in development, for more than 15 years, and I've yet to see it. The reality is that it lacks adaptability. It's square peg, round hole. It's great in theory, but in practice, it's either non-applicable, too expensive, and so the status quo, as broken as that may be, remains the practical and, most importantly, viable way to build. Specifically within the product, process, and viability buckets, these are compounded risk areas that make it absolutely a non-starter to even consider the additional risk of mass timber within any rational development company's analysis. In conclusion, the relative uncertainty, a word we've heard up here a couple times, and unfamiliarity of the end users, approval authorities, and trades, coupled with the known additional costs versus the potential marginal benefits, means demonstrably that the risk far outweighs the reward and is therefore not worth the risk. Thank you.
I think that you all may have some questions for each other after this. Okay, Jana, you're going to wind things up here for us.
Thank you. How do I advance it just on this? Right. So tonight you've heard quite a bit about the uncertainty of using mass timber and the potential benefits. You've also heard about some of the risks. I'm here to talk about the overhyped solution of climate change and how wood might be able to benefit that. So I think in terms of some of the risks that Graham talked about, when they're really around project-based risks, there's a lot of other benefits that we can actually see with mass timber. And you can see some of those here. But I think the biggest benefit that we see from using mass timber, it's really this, and it's our planet. And I don't think that's an overhyped solution. I think there's a moral issue here about thinking about how we have a broader and more long-term goal or long-term view of what we can do with a low-carbon solution. So we have a diversity of landscapes, ecosystems, and habitats that make the world a very rich place to live. But our planet is warming at an alarming rate because of the burning of fossil fuels. And that puts all of us and our diversity at risk. So both of these materials, concrete and steel, have an absolute place in the building industry, and we're not here to argue that there is no place for them. I'm actually working on projects that are the right material or right buildings for concrete or steel. But both of these materials require carbon-intensive extraction and burning of fossil fuels in their production. Now, carbon is not a greenhouse gas, it's an element, and when burned, it releases some. When burned or released from fossil fuels, it combines it with oxygen to form CO2, which is the greenhouse gas, and that is what causes global warming or the greenhouse effect. And that's the problem. So as a result, the building industry is one of the largest contributors to global CO2 emissions, accounting for about 39%. Numbers are up or down, not always 39, sometimes it's 42%, of annual carbon emissions worldwide. And as urbanization continues to rise, so does the environmental impact of construction. And mass timber is a sustainable alternative that can help mitigate some of these things. And for that reason alone, mass timber is worth any project-related risk that you might hear today. But maybe just a little bit about wood. It is a regenerative material. It's grown by the sun. Mass timber is the only primary structural material approved by the International Building Code that is derived from a living carbon sequestering resource. One of the most compelling advantages of using mass timber is that it sequesters carbon. And really what that means is that it absorbs CO2 from the atmosphere trees absorb CO2 from the atmosphere as they grow, and that acts as a natural carbon sink. And Canada is a massive carbon sink. We have a lot of forests. Whoops, sorry. I had some audio that's not playing. Canada is a massive urban sink. We have a lot of forests, in fact, 44 million hectares in BC and 367 million hectares in Canada. This is what carbon sequestration looks and sounds like, that activity that happens in the background. And here, I gave it away already, but this is what the alternative is, what mining activities look and sound like 24/7. So what's the alternative? Back to the beautiful carbon sequestration, if you need to be convinced further. And just some statistics, and I know the other side is going to argue that these statistics are questionable, but in 1 year, a mature live tree can absorb more than 48 pounds of CO2. And it's estimated that 1 cubic meter of mass timber sequestered 1 ton of CO2 from the atmosphere. But in contrast, 1 ton of manufactured cement produces about half a ton of CO2, and 1 ton of manufactured steel produces about 0.6 tons of CO2. So really, do you take it out or do you put more in? That closed loop cycle of using mass timber keeps that carbon within that same closed loop. Whereas if you're using steel and concrete, you're actually putting more carbon into the atmosphere. So the argument to say it doesn't really, we don't know what the numbers are, we know there is some benefit. Any benefit is better than no benefit. So the other thing to think about is obviously mass timber buildings have lower embodied carbon than concrete or steel. I know this is hard to read, maybe, but embodied carbon is measured using global warming potential, which quantifies the total greenhouse gas emissions associated with the product or material's life cycle, from raw material extraction to disposal. There's a graph showing, this graph right here, showing the different material contribution to global warming potential. And you can see in that little tiny orange slot what is tiny. Another slide that shows the global warming potential intensity breakdown of new construction projects. The magenta and the orange are what the superstructure contributes. And usually those things are made of concrete and steel. And so when you think about changing that material, the thing that the building, it stays there for the life of the building, and using mass timber for that, that makes a huge difference in the embodied carbon of the structure. So some may suggest that cutting down trees is counterintuitive, causes deforestation, and is not sustainable. But deforestation is around changing land use, and that is not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is using wood from sustainably managed forests. And in this country, all of our forests are sustainably managed because there's a lot of regulation that happens here. BC has roughly the same amount of forested areas as it did before European settlement, making it one of the few regions in the world with virtually no significant deforestation. So in summary, the alternative is just not worth it. With 1 degree of warming, climate change impacts are directly and already felt around the world and here in British Columbia. This is just a slide of a few examples. Arctic ice melting, that impacts habitats, it leads to sea level rise, and and also global warming, because the sea, once the Arctic ice melts, it absorbs heat and causes more global warming. So extreme flooding, everybody remembers the flood from 2021 where 5 people died, 670,000 livestock perished. And then talk about the economic impacts. Canada now has a fire season. It's not just a few isolated wildfires, but when you think about the cost impact of that, and then the continuing climate change that is a result of that. The pine beetle infestation, and then the loss of biodiversity and habitats. All of these environmental consequences have greater economic and social impacts than a single project's risks. And in summary, why is mass timber worth the risks? Because we can't afford not to reap the benefits. Thank you.
Thanks. That was very passionate, all of those. I'd like to start with giving each team an opportunity to ask one question of the other team, if you want to do that. If not, I'll go to the audience or to my questions. But if you have something you'd like to ask the other team, something they brought up and where you're just, wait a minute, how did you get to that? Go ahead. Yeah, you can confer. You can call your parents, or I think. Oh, you're really working on this. Oh my God. I should have announced this before. Okay, I'm going to let you all start here on the
So we
pro side.
have a question. Both of your talks, very passionate. Thank you very much. And, Shawn, at the end of your talk, you articulated, I think, very soundly that, when we want to compare this to these other emerging biogenic materials, bamboo and low carbon concrete, they're not there yet. And this is our solution, which again is on this presumption that we're in the spirit of low carbon materials. And Jana, your talk points it out. I'd like to ask you if there is a world where it turns out that mass timber buildings, including all these uncertainties in the forest, which we can get to why there are uncertainties there, if it would be a material that doesn't potentially save that much carbon. In fact, it doesn't do much compared to reinforced concrete. It doesn't mean to say wood, there's light frame timber we can talk about, but mass timber, should we still be going ahead with it?
Sure. I mean, we can start maybe in the forest, and we're happy to talk about all those complexities because it absolutely is a complex carbon equation there. You mentioned some things about net emissions. All those studies from the National Inventory Report only look at managed forests. They don't look at any of the forests that we're not actively managing. The biggest emission source in our forests are fires, which are actively caused or are caused by not managing the forest properly, all of those types of things. So it is a very complicated equation, no doubt. At the end of the day, the reason why we want to use wood in the built environment and why designers want to is because it's been shown through as much evidence as possible, not even just ourselves. These are third-party accounts, BC Housing saying, it can deliver 70% reduction compared to concrete buildings at 12-story scale. You have RBC saying that mass timber can cut emissions by 90 megatons could cut emissions by 90 megatons or 10% of the sector's emissions by 2030. That's the fundamental reason why mass timber is good, and that's why we're comparing it to more carbon-intensive alternates like concrete.
Okay.
Also argue that, yes, we should still be using it, because wouldn't you want another choice?
And at the end of the day, too, it's about our local economy as well. This is about jobs. It's about a key driver for our sector.
Okay, Jana, why don't you ask this team a question?
Our question to you is, what other options do you see in terms of building low-carbon housing at scale and/or creating efficiency in our high-rise construction sector?
Oh, I'm glad you asked.
And another great thing about West Group.
Well, there's a lot of important sort of pieces that got raised there. I mean, one of the things I took a little bit of issue with was the relative productivity within the construction sector. When we hark back to those days of the 50s when we can bang out a Vancouver special in seemingly, a number of months, it was all predicated off a single set of plans, and I'm sure it was approved in a month and built in 9. In a bid for operationally better buildings, our buildings have become immensely more complicated. Layered into that is like an insane amount of policy at all levels of government that have been added into this, significantly increasing the complexity of all these projects. For us now, it takes 3 to 4 years to get a project approved, and up to 3 years to build a project. If we were going to put a significant emphasis on improving the efficiency, there's a whole host of paperwork that we could do just to make these projects simpler, faster, to address the housing crisis, but also address the productivity crisis. And the reality is we're building better buildings, far better buildings than we ever built in the past, to sort of compare those statistics. I think if you put an equivalent amount of effort into things like low carbon concrete, or just actually reducing wastage in process, in actual materials, through things like prefabrication and better design up front. If you did all the things that we say we need to do to make this mass timber industry work, if we applied that to the way we're currently building, I think we'd have far more gains in a very immediate time frame.
So are you going to pay the architects more for all that coordination?
If they do it well.
I just complement that answer to, another slide and different conversation, but conversations that are familiar in Vancouver around urban design and carbon emissions. And these studies, repeat in Toronto, Europe, and you hear is that at the beginning stage of how you're planning your future city and dealing with density, if you are focusing on low rise, high density versus high rise, high density, you are offering alternatives of construction that lead to a lower embodied carbon city per capita. Now, if you're dealing with low rise, high density, you're dealing with 6 stories or less. And the moment you're dealing with 6 stories, right, it's not like you're not talking about wood, but you're now talking about light frame timber, something that we know is not 20 or 30% lower carbon in the estimates, but 50 to 80% more. And if you're in that realm, you're in a definitive low carbon realm, and that's the realm we should be living in.
Oh, okay. The Jericho Defender, or the Jericho Lands opposition group will be happy to hear that, I think.
Call me anytime. Call me.
I agree with that, Adam.
I feel like this audience has way better questions to ask than I do. I do have some, but I'd like to give the audience first an opportunity to ask questions. We'd like you to direct any question you have to one person on the panel, like not everyone, and be very specific about it. So if you would put your hand up if you have a question, someone will come around with a microphone. So.
Hi, thank you. This is on. One question I have around, there's a lot of emphasis around production and the viability of making mass timber work from a construction standpoint and to save money there. A significant problem with development is getting the insurance for a new product, and without having previous tall mass timber buildings as examples for insurance companies, the premiums are significant and the time to get your course of construction is significant as well. Is there any movement from Woodworks BC to either support or develop their own kind of insurance where they would essentially put their money where their mouth is and back their own product from an insurance perspective?
So I run a very small nonprofit, just to start there. But I think a lot of the challenges that the other side has brought up, and the insurance challenge, is just that it's new. We don't have that many built examples. We need to get better as we go over time. You know, Tesla, Airbnb, all of these things were expensive at the beginning. All innovation is. And we're teaching the entire supply chain how to deal with a new product. Engineers, architects, contractors, developers, real estate and home buyers, what this product is. You know, you're educating across the entire value chain, and the insurance industry, how they assess risk is just number of built examples, not the way that we assess risk as an engineer using first principles. There are some leaders, even within the audience in the insurance sector, I would say, talk to them and get a good rate, but a lot of education is what our team focuses on every day to build capacity and to drive down costs over time. That's every aspect of design and construction.
Great, thank you. Another question. A hand down here.
I'm kind of wondering if there's constraints with mass timber in terms of expression, because a lot of what I see looks pretty much stacked and modular, and I'm hoping that maybe it's because it's a new technology, they haven't pushed the boundaries of what it physically can do in terms of, say, cantilevers, or the formal curvilinearity of it doesn't seem to have expressed much. I'm wondering if that's something that people are thinking about as a comparative to concrete or steel, which has been well explored.
Well, have you been to Van Dusen?
Yes.
So that's a mass timber building. And so I think that the limitations of how you express a building depends on the typology. There's lots of examples of mass timber buildings at a small scale that can be as expressive as you can imagine. They may not be solved the same way as a concrete or steel building, and again, it's the right material for the right use. But when you're starting to build up and taller buildings, there's an efficiency in thinking about the size of a panel and designing a building around the size of that, whether it's CLT or whatever, and thinking about how do you get it to be the most cost effective, which happens in concrete as well. It's, you know, a floor slab that is a rectangle is cheaper than a floor slab that has cantilevers. So I think, you know, mass timber gets a bad rap because buildings look like rectangles, but I mean, if you look at the city, it's not exactly innovation on the concrete side.
and I was going to ask Graham to answer that too, because we were having a conversation before, and I think he has thoughts on this.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question because the material itself can really do anything. It's incredibly flexible and can be adapted a whole bunch of different ways. But that's when you get into the sort of a bunch of the sort of special use cases where it's more of an art, much like concrete can be an art if you apply it in a different way. There's a more sort of hardcore fundamental real estate development perspective. If you want to make things more affordable, you make them simple and repeatable. Like from a structural perspective, everything loves to stack. So if you can have a stacked rectangular box that's as simple a form as possible, it's efficient from an envelope perspective, it's efficient from a structural perspective, and often you're going to have all your mechanical runs all sort of go in the right place. It's easy to do, it's easy for trades to understand, it's easy to execute, it's easy to repair. There's like a lot of good things about it. So like when we kind of get to the core elements of how we can see more of this, how we can see more of mass timber. Like mass timber works really well when you're able to repeat it too for the methodology reasons. So if you're going to have a bunch of offsite construction, have limited ability to change things on site, rectangular, simple boxes that stack are exactly what you want to be doing. There's further challenges with mass timber in particular that when you sort of stack it up against concrete. Balconies are a real challenge. Like wood, if it gets exposed to water, will rot. Concrete doesn't. So concrete, when you're forming it up and you need to put a balcony on, you can just project that balcony out. Yeah, I know there's some thermal bridging issues. And wrap your envelope around that. With mass timber, you can't do that. You can't project CLT out because it'll rot, and you're now exposing that at that core. So you have to come up with, there are solutions, they're just technical, or there's technical solutions that will work, they're just cost prohibitive at this point, and then brings in a whole bunch of new materials, new complexity that just hasn't been tested in the marketplace. So I think it's possible, but the reason that you see that is for more sort of fundamental development reasons, simple, repeatable, and that's what you need to do for prefab and offsite construction to really.
Okay, Shawn, I saw you shaking your head when he was talking about the balconies. I have to let you answer that, or both of you.
There's durability challenges around any material. If any material is getting wet, there's risk of corrosion of rebar. There's risk of melting and fire of rebar and of steel structures. Those are all real challenges. But the ability of mass timber, actually more than 200 of those 360 projects I mentioned are in the institutional space. Glulam's a fabulous product. You can curve it. You can do a whole bunch of beautiful architecture with Glulam, and there really is no constraint within that sector, whether it's cultural buildings, institutional buildings. That's where you're really seeing architecture gems. And I actually think that perception of mass timber being a premium product has kind of hurt it and slowed it down in terms of its use in residential or commercial, more rectilinear rectilinear building types. And it's kind of led to this perception that it will always and is a premium product. Whereas if we're optimizing and getting better over time, prices will come down. And the opportunities for the technology are really within broader scale adoption.
Okay, another question from the audience. I see Trevor's hand up, so do you want to bring the microphone up here?
Thanks for the presentations, they were super. There's one key realm of risk that neither team has brought up, and I'd like to do so now. And maybe I'll direct it at Jana, since we have to do it that way. The realm is cultural and political change as a risk factor. I'm astonished how quickly the landscape is changing, and it's not just Trump. The world would be easier if it just was. ESG standards are falling by the wayside. Our Liberal Prime Minister reduced the carbon tax. We can have 100 other examples. The cultural place of greenness is changing amazingly quickly, and the political landscape with it. That's a huge risk to both teams' positions. Tell me what you do, have we reached peak green, and what can be done if we are going through a historic change in sentiment about sustainability?
I don't think that we reached peak green. I think that there's maybe a lot of negativity just given where the world is, and it's more expensive to build, and sustainable buildings do cost more. Anyone who's done a zero carbon building, a passive house, you're paying more. But I think we need to separate kind of the upfront costs from the operating costs to be able to really understand what the impact is. But, you know, I don't think that we've reached the peak. There's still potential for us to look at, you know, and it's not just mass timber that's going to be part of the solution. I think there's a lot of other things that we need to think about that are going to be part of the solution to get there, because I don't think we can afford to give up. What about our children, our grandchildren, all of our ancestors? What are we leaving them? And, you know, when you think about the climate crisis that we're going through right now, how can we possibly think that this is all that we can do?
I mean, there's definitely something of that in the air, but, you know, I'm left still with kind of a, you know, weird point here. The lowest carbon way to house people, you know, when you account for all the numbers and the uncertainty, is a 6-story light frame timber building with baseboard heaters. Code compliant, step code 2. Don't go for passive house. Just they're building that in the kind of the lower mainland, left and right. Here in Vancouver, we're sort of in this sort of, well, shouldn't we be thinking more? I mean, they're not very pretty buildings, you know, I mean, some other shapes. And all of that is peripheral talk anyway that dilutes our green agenda that we started with. So we want to be realistic about carbon. We're already doing it. We would be doing it without the politics, and we need to keep doing it and keep towards that level of densification if we have any real role to play on this debate. Ironically, all these other cities and regions that don't care about climate change, they're doing that too. And so the more we can advocate for just the simplest, sensible, lightweight buildings, the more we're going to be speaking truly to the problem at hand.
And wood is good.
Wood is good.
I think it's also a bit of like, it's a bit of crisis triage. I think that it's got to a point now where, you know, I think the climate crisis is on everybody's mind, but the more acute crisis is on everybody's, can be more pressing on an individual, and they can't afford a home in Vancouver, and so like they can't afford a home now in Abbotsford, like, so that the weight of that is sort of more immediate, and you want to sort of see that more solvable problem immediately. So I think that's sort of a challenge to deal with. I think there's a lot of wastage that can be removed in a lot of our processes and a lot of our product. And I think there's a more efficient way to do this, and I think that I'd love to, you know, see us tackling that in whatever form that we're doing, tackling existing wastage in the existing system as a method to fix a bunch of these crises.
Okay, we had some great questions from the audience. I have a lot more. I'll have to save them for another time. Like, is there any innovations that you do like, for example, Graham? But don't answer, because we're going to move on. And you can actually answer it in your closing remarks if you want. So now each member of the team gets 2 minutes for closing up, making points that came up or that they already decided they were going to say at the beginning. So Adam, you're first up.
Jeez. I forget what I was going to say. Okay, I'll start with an anecdote, which is up my part. I mean, if we have people from practice in the room, you might know what LEED is, right? We heard about LEED. We do a LEED building. If you're in LEED energy, if you get a LEED standard on a building, been around for 20 years. So it came out of the U.S. Green Building Council. Let's metricize ourselves through design. We'll use simulation for energy efficiency, water. We'll get some credits. We'll post on the building. This is the way we get to energy efficiency. Every little bit helps if we can get there. 20 years later, same U.S. Departments of Energy and other academics have done studies of these buildings and found that, in fact, they consume, on average, more energy than even their baseline counterparts. So much other stuff got them. They were institutional, sort of glorious buildings to shine at. What I'd like to just advocate for you and what we're voting for, I'm not against mass timber products. In fact, on Woodworks BC, there's a great site I was kind of diving in today in terms of the use of mass timber products in otherwise light frame construction. We're using it sparingly where it's needed, where it's sensible for manufacturability, for cost, and even where possible for carbon. What I'm suggesting is we need to get out of the mindset that when we talk about mass timber and we immediately identify with these buildings that are like, well, that's like mass timber, and like look at it, that often those seem these kind of illusionary, kind of panacea-like projects that actually have very limited energy efficiency and embodied carbon benefits. They're the equivalent of a LEED stamp of which I'm worried 20 years from now, we're going to do the studies and find they didn't result in the carbon savings that we were expecting. I'm against the motion that we move into a landscape where we're going to give a carte blanche to the topic of mass timber. We need to have much more sensible, risk-measured solutions here. It might involve the products where needed, but not mass timber writ large without any worries. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And in case you hadn't guessed, we're going to go in the order of the beginning. So Shawn?
Here, right?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
First, I want to agree a little bit with what Adam just said in terms of keeping housing short. But if we are going to build tall buildings, that's where mass timber must occur. You know, our concrete is a massive global emitter in terms of our construction sector, roughly 20% of emissions. And at the end of the day, the way that we're looking at carbon right now is very simplified in LCAs. We aren't accounting for any carbon sequestration. If we were to do that, wood buildings would absolutely crush everything else. Now, there are technical risks and they're solvable. We've all kind of agreed on that today, but the financial risks, and looking at a developer here, following the free market, these need to come down over time to reach scale. And the social benefits are just enormous, and there's a role for the government to play, there's a role for incentives to come into play, to spur on that industry, to spur widespread adoption so that prices come down over time. We can't ignore the societal benefits of carbon, potential indigenous reconciliation and building a new supply chain of materials, local economic development, and the potential for faster construction methods. We cannot keep doing the same construction methods that we've been doing today and build faster. We need to improve the way that we do construction. So we might face some bumps along the way here, but we will solve those challenges. And if we are going to build tall buildings in this city, which we absolutely do in this province, construction is trending taller and taller. We need to find better solutions for them.
Thank you. Graham?
CBC Debaters is one of my favorite radio programs, and so I have a few colleagues here that I did promise some wood puns to, so I apologize to the rest of you, but I still think I can get to the root of the problem. So, from the perspective of a real estate developer, the primary builder of 95% of the market housing stock, these softies are putting too much value on the wrong kind of green, and candidly, can't see the forest for the trees. I'll go out on a limb against the grain and make an analogy to my own family tree. Knowing what I know, I recommend we pursue a mass timber versus conventional development. If we had only one project to do, not a chance. It will not spruce up the performer, but will rather leave you pining for alternatives. Being hemlocked into a specialty material and methodology with limited suppliers and few alternatives early in a project is a recipe for disaster when you understand the importance of risk mitigation through the entire development process. It's not A-OK, to accept that level of risk. Even if just maple, there is a potential benefit. Cedar are quantifiable reasons that sap the rationale out of any argument for the use of mass timber. It's clear to be seen. And if you can't wrap your heads around that, perhaps you should sit down. For real. I think there's a bunch of important things that we've sort of tackled here tonight. I think one of the biggest things is that there's a recognized massive amount of additional complexity within all of these projects. For mass timber to work, we need to solve a bunch of that complexity. I think we should solve that complexity within the forms that we're currently building and focus on the right materials for the right jobs.
Thank you. And thanks for that Olympic level number of puns, terrible puns. Okay. Jana.
Well, thank you. Overall, I think we agree on many points, and I think we agree that there are some tremendous global benefits to using mass timber. Really, the numbers don't matter. If it's even 1% of an improvement and makes a difference, that is worth that 1%. It's the same argument. It's like, well, my vote doesn't count, but it does count. Every single percentage counts in terms of the fight against climate change. Talked about project risks, and then, I think looking at building level risks, which I think is generally what you've been looking at, Graham, we need to look at the global risks and have a much longer term view of what the benefits of mass timber are. Around uncertainty, again, it doesn't really matter whether it's 25% of a reduction or if it's 10% reduction. Any reduction in embodied carbon matters and makes a difference when you add it all up. And I think the more that we think about building with mass timber, the more of that impact we're going to have. To touch on the argument that what if we realize that there is no benefit? How many people have said, I love being in a wood building? Wood buildings make you feel good. They have a biophilic element. The quality of construction, just because we actually, as architects, we care about the wood, about designing a wood building. We get excited about it. And the level of coordination, the effort that you put into it, you reap the benefits of. And I think that, the compensation, when it's a concrete building, it's like, oh, everybody's done it already, we can solve it on site. Well, guess what? We can't solve it on site with mass timber, so we're going to solve it in the office. And so I think just overall, the number of benefits that come with mass timber really have to outweigh the risks that we talk about today that are just about the project and the padding the pockets of the developers. Thank you.
The actual brawl will be taking place backstage. I am just going to close, not by giving any of my feeble thoughts on mass timber, but by saying how wonderful it is that we can have these kinds of conversations in a world where there's so much polarization and people unwilling to listen to each other, very dug in on their positions and willing to inflict incredible pain to be right and prove that everyone else is wrong. It's really wonderful to come to an evening like this where people speak their minds but listen respectfully to the others and are willing to think about what they have to say. And that is such a valuable part of our social world here in Vancouver, in Canada. And I just want to say I think we all appreciate that very much, that you're able to come here and do this. So on that note, now you get to vote, the hard part. We do have Elon Musk's machines in place to do the vote counting, so it'll be totally honest. There won't be any skewing of the vote. And if we could go now to vote number 2. Okay. So the results of the first vote, if you'll recall, were pro 19%, con 81. Came in pretty pro-mass timber there. Second vote, pro 32%. Con 68. I told you, when you come in high, very hard to keep winning. So the winners are the pro side, and you get to build a building.